What if the most dangerous thing in the world was not the darkness that escapes, but the one small thing that remains? In the ancient Greek tradition, whispered through centuries of firelight and olive groves, there is a story that has haunted the human heart since the very first God-shaped clay into something breathing and curious. It is a story about a woman, a vessel, and a moment of impossible choice, the kind of choice that changed everything forever. They say the gods knew what they were doing when they sealed that jar. They say nothing inside it was accidental. But there is one thing, one quiet, trembling thing, that even the darkest myths could never bring themselves to destroy. Something so fragile it hides beneath suffering, yet so enduring it has outlasted every catastrophe mankind has ever known. Tonight, we follow its story into the ancient world, into the shadows, into the warmth of something we almost forgot we still carry. Welcome to the story of Pandora's box and the last thing left inside. Now lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. The stars above Olympus burned with a cold, silver-white light that night, each one sharp as a struck flint against the black. Below, the mortal world glowed faintly. New fields, new rivers, new fires threading through the dark like scattered embers. Those fires were wrong. The gods knew it. They gathered on the open marble platform, their robes pulled close against a wind that smelled of ozone and cold granite, and they looked down. No one spoke first. The silence was not peace. It was the held breath before a verdict, the moment when a decision already made waits only for a mouth to speak it. Zeus sat alone on his throne. The others had drawn back without being told, some instinct in them reading the particular quality of his quiet. He did not look at the gods gathered behind him. His gaze had dropped to the mortal fires below, and it stayed there. One broad hand rested open on his knee, palm upward, utterly still. A lesser god might have raised a fist. Zeus had learned, across uncountable years, that the open hand delivers more lasting harm. He watched a fire catch and spread between two hills, a shepherd's signal or a forge. It was impossible to say, and something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Colder than anger, a thought arrived, and he closed his fingers slowly around it, and the thought was this: not punishment, but a gift. A gift so precisely shaped to the wound it would open that the man who received it would call it beautiful. The command reached Hephaestus the way all commands from Zeus reached him, not as words, but as pressure. A sudden weight behind the eyes, the forge fire dropping half a shade in color. He set down the half-finished buckle in his hand. It rang once against the stone floor. The air in the forge smelled of iron scale and charcoal, and the particular mineral sharpness of water poured on heated rock. He had been given instructions before. Weapons. Chains strong enough to hold gods. Nets fine enough to shame a spider's work. But a woman. River clay and moon-cold light, shaped into something that would breathe and want and grieve. His left hand found the edge of the great stone work table. His calloused fingers pressed into the grit there, steadying. He had never made anything meant to suffer. The thought sat in his chest like a coal held too long in the palm, not hot enough to drop, not cool enough to bear. Athena came alone before the lamps of Olympus were lit from morning. The marble chamber held the cold of a room nobody had warmed in hours, the kind that settles into the joints of the fingers and makes the knuckles ache. She stood before the clay figure Hephaestus had left on the low stone platform, still, pale, smelling faintly of river mud and calcined bone. Athena pressed one hand flat against the figure's sternum. She did not speak. What passed from her palm into the clay was not warmth. It was a splinter, small and insistent, lodged where it could not be reached or removed. The need to ask why. The need to keep asking after the answer came. Athena stepped back. She looked at the figure for a long moment, at the closed eyes and the mouth not yet ready for words. Something moved through her, not pride, not sorrow, but their uneasy cousin. She left without naming it. Aphrodite arrived at dusk in the garden terrace where the rose bushes moved without wind. She walked through them without looking at them, their petals brushing her wrist, leaving faint red traces she did not notice or did not mind. She crouched before the clay figure, still upright, still sealed against the cooling air, and studied the face the way a sculptor studies work not their own, measuring what is absent. Then she leaned in close. What she pressed into the skin of the jaw and the line of the throat was not beauty as ornament. It was something that would make strangers turn and keep turning. Something that would cause people to want, and then, failing to possess, to resent. She knew this. She did it anyway. When Aphrodite drew back, the expression on her face was not pride in the work. It was something quieter, the look of a woman who has given a gift she knows will cost the recipient more than it will cost herself. Hermes came at dawn, when the light from Olympus still held its warmth, but the dark of the mortal world below pressed up against the threshold, like cold water at a doorstep. He settled beside the clay figure cross-legged, close enough that his winged sandals nearly touched her feet, and he began to speak. Not to instruct, to pour. Words fell into her the way water finds the shape of whatever holds it, the names of birds and roots and seasons, the difference between asking and demanding, the precise angle at which a question sounds like wonder but opens like a key. He taught her the sentence that means both yes and maybe, He taught her the pause that makes a listener lean in. When he finished, he sat back and grinned, not at the figure, but at the thought of what those words would do once a tongue behind them learned to move. The breath arrived before anything else. A cold pull of mountain air, sharp with ice melt, and the faint resinous bite of cedar smoke drifting up from somewhere impossibly far below. Pandora's chest rose. Her fingers curled against stone. Then her eyes opened. She did not look at Hermes. She did not look at the colonnades, or the sky, or the gods gathered at the edges of her sight like figures waiting to be acknowledged. Her gaze moved past all of it, past the marble, past the gold, and found the rim of Olympus, where the mountain fell away into open air. Far beneath, the mortal world lay spread like a piece of worked leather. Green hills, dark river threads, the pale gold of dry fields, and rising from several points among them, thin columns of smoke from morning fires. Something in her chest tilted toward it. Not thought, not yet. A lean, the way a flame angles toward a draft it cannot see. Her feet had not yet found the ground beneath her. Still, she reached. Zeus came to her without ceremony. He carried the jar himself. No herald, no procession, just the broad weight of him crossing the marble and the deep, wet thud of terracotta set down against stone floor. The jar reached her chest. Its belly was the dark reddish brown of fired clay, left long in smoke, and around its shoulder ran a band of carved figures, men and animals and shapes that bent into other shapes, worn so smooth by age that her eyes could not hold them, each figure sliding into the next before she could name it. A cord of dark twisted fiber wound twice around the sealed lid, pressing into the clay as though it had been there longer than the clay deserved. The pitch sealing the neck had gone black and hard, and had cracked along one line, then held. Zeus told her it was a wedding gift. He told her to keep it safe. He told her, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man stating what he considers obvious, never to open it. Pandora said she understood. Her eyes were on the carvings. The path down from Olympus began in cloud and ended in dust. Hermes walked ahead, his sandals barely troubling the stone, while Pandora followed with the jar braced against her hip, one arm hooked around its belly and the other pressed flat against its painted shoulder. The air changed as they descended, the bright cold thinning into something heavier, carrying pine resin and wild thyme crushed underfoot, and the loamy warmth of soil that had never been frost. Bird song reached her from somewhere in the oak canopy. Not a single note, but a layered, overlapping argument of small creatures she had no names for yet. Then the jar moved, not shifted, moved. A single contraction through the clay, as though something inside had drawn one slow breath and held it. Pandora stopped walking. Her palm felt the curve of it, ordinary and warm from her own body heat. She said nothing. Hermes did not look back. Epimetheus was crouching on the hillside above the valley path, pressing his thumb into the soil beside a limestone outcrop to see how deep the moisture went, when he heard footsteps on the gravel below. He straightened. The late sun came in low and amber from the west, throwing his own long shadow back up the slope behind him. There was a woman on the path. She was carrying a jar. His brother's voice came to him then, Prometheus always arriving with his warnings pressed flat like dried herbs between his palms. Never accept gifts from Zeus. But the thought arrived, half-formed, and went no further. Because she had looked up. Those eyes, wide and restless and full of a question she had not yet spoken, found his across the distance of the hillside. Something in Epimetheus's chest simply released. The jar in her arms caught the light, deep red against her cream linen. He did not move. He forgot what he had been checking the soil for. They carried the jar inside together, his hands beneath hers on the belly of it, and set it on the high shelf in the corner of the main room where the wall met the rafter. It sat there. Days passed. Epimetheus dragged timber for the doorframe, and Pandora learned where the spring was, how far the nearest village lay, which stones held heat longest after the fire went low. The house filled with the smell of wood smoke and damp wool, and the wild thyme she hung to dry from a nail. She learned to sleep to the sound of his breathing. She stopped noticing the jar the way you stop noticing a wall. But she always knew where it was. Not by looking. She never looked. She simply knew, the way a healed wound knows exactly where it is the moment the cold comes in. The first time, she told herself it was the wind finding a gap in the thatch, a low, drawn-out sound, almost a syllable, drifting from the corner where the shelf was. She pulled the wool blanket closer and slept. The second time, she lay still and counted the sounds she knew. Epimetheus breathing, an ember settling, a moth batting against the shuttered window, and placed the sound inside that list and was satisfied. But the third night she woke, and her feet were already on the cold stone floor before she knew she had moved. She stood in the dark kitchen, the embers a thin orange line across the hearthstones, and she listened. It came again. Low, wet, pressed through clay. Her name, recognizably, unmistakably her name, shaped by something that had no mouth. Her chest opened with a terror so large it had room for longing inside it. She did not move toward the jar. She did not move away. Morning came, and she told him. Epimetheus was tearing bread, his broad, calloused hands pulling the loaf apart with the easy force of a man who never thinks about his hands, and she sat across the table and said, "There is a sound that comes from the jar at night, a voice. It says, 'My name.'" He stopped. He looked at her face first, with the careful attention he gave to things he did not want to misunderstand. Then he looked at the jar on its shelf, visible through the kitchen doorway, reddish brown and still in the pale window light. He tilted his head. He listened for a long moment, the bread slack in his fingers. Then he looked back at her with an expression she had no word for. Not disbelief, not concern, but something gentler and more final than either. He said he heard nothing. The bread sat between them on the table, warm and solid and smelling of char and grain, and Pandora folded her hands in her lap and nodded. That night there were 2 voices. The next night, 3. Not louder, if anything, softer, which was worse. One was low and unhurried, the tone a person uses when they already know they are right. It told her she was the only one who heard because she was the only one meant to. Another came in quicker, brighter, with something almost like warmth in it, that the jar held not danger, but completion, the answers to questions already forming in her blood that she had not yet learned to ask. She sat with her back against the cold plaster wall, knees drawn up, the jar just above her hair on the shelf. The terracotta lip was 3 finger widths from her scalp. She could feel the faint chill radiating off it. She said aloud, into the dark, "You are not telling me the truth." The low voice agreed immediately. It said, "Keeping something sealed is just another name for fear." She said, "That is not what I meant." The voice did not answer. Her own heartbeat filled the silence, which meant she had been listening hard enough to notice it stop. She had slept, though she could not have said when. Gray light pressed through the small window above the shelf, pale and flat, the color of ash wood soaked overnight. Epimetheus breathed beside her in long, even pulls, one hand open on the wool blanket between them, fingers slightly curled. She lay on her back and did not move. The ceiling was rough plaster, marked with a hairline crack that ran from the corner above her head toward the window. She had looked at it before. She looked at it now. The decision had not arrived this morning. She understood that, lying still with her hands folded over her ribs. It had been arriving for weeks, the way a river undermines a bank, not all at once, but particle by particle, until one morning the ground simply is not there. She was not afraid. That was the thing she noticed, and sat with, and did not trust. She would only look. She would lift the lid, see what was held inside, and then she would know. Knowledge could not be worse than this. The low voice, The brightness, the 3-finger widths of terracotta between her scalp and whatever breathed inside. She only wanted to understand what she was carrying. Epimetheus exhaled slowly. She did not wake him. She rose without sound and crossed to the shelf. The jar was cold when she took it, cold in the way stone is cold before the house is warmed, not the cold of night, but the cold of something that holds no heat of its own. She carried it with both hands pressed flat against its belly, and it was heavier than she remembered. Not impossible, just more than she had prepared for, the way a bucket of water is always heavier once it leaves the ground. She set it on the table. The base met the wood with a low, dense thud that moved up through her palms and into her wrists. Then the voices stopped, not faded, not quieted, stopped all at once, clean as a hand placed flat over a drum. She stood with her fingers still resting on the shoulder of the jar and waited for one of them to resume. The pale morning light lay across the table in a narrow band. A fly moved somewhere in the thatch above. Epimetheus breathed steadily in the next room. Nothing came from inside the jar, only the silence of something that was listening. Her fingers found the cord before she made the decision to touch it. The twisted fiber was rough against her fingertips, stiff with age, wound twice around the lid and the neck of the jar in 2 tight loops. She worked the first loop with her thumb, and it slid, not reluctantly, but cleanly, the way a knot loosens when it has been tied by someone who expected it to be untied. The second loop followed. The cord unspooled into her palm in a single slow coil, and it lay there across her lifeline, lighter than she had imagined. Dry, faintly gritty with the dust of the shelf. She waited for something to resist her. Nothing did. The third loop had already come free on its own, the cord's own weight pulling the last turn loose against the clay. The lid sat bare now, reddish-brown, cracked along one edge, and the silence inside the jar pressed upward against it. She set the cord down on the table. It curled there and stayed. She lifted the lid 1 inch. The smell arrived before the darkness did. Old iron and winter wind, and something beneath both of those, something wet and close that did not belong to any season she had known. Her stomach contracted before her mind had named it. 2 inches. The darkness came then, not all at once, but in threads, thin as smoke from a snuffed wick, curling upward through the gap and spreading across the underside of the lid and across her fingers, and she felt no warmth, no cold, nothing where her skin should have been. The threads thickened. A sound rose with them, low and plural, not one voice but many pressed together into a single exhalation that filled the kitchen from floor to thatch. She dropped the lid. The crack of clay on clay rang off the stone walls, but the threads were already free, pouring upward in silence now, fanning out across the ceiling in dark, branching lines. Pandora stepped back, and her heel caught the table leg, and she knew, in the base of her throat and the soles of her feet, and somewhere deep in the architecture of her ribs, that the lid no longer mattered. It was done. They did not roar. That was the first wrong thing. They moved through the walls the way a chill moves through wool, not breaking it, simply arriving on the other side. The first one passed through her chest before she understood it, as separate from herself, a coldness that found the sternum and pressed not painfully, but with the specific, patient weight of a hand that does not intend to lift. She breathed in. It was still there when she breathed out. The second came low, settling behind her eyes like the hour before a fever breaks, a heaviness that had no source and wanted none. Her lids pulled. The morning light through the small window looked far away. Then the voice, not the voices from the jar, not the plural exhalation of the night before. One voice, dry and close, speaking in the particular register of a thought she might have had herself. It said she was not enough. It said she had known this and pretended otherwise. It moved through the east wall and was gone into the valley before she could close her mouth around a denial. The last one she barely felt, only a tiredness that had lived too long to hurry, settling into the tendons behind her knees and the base of her neck. Old, patient, the house stood quiet around her. The jar sat on the table, open and still. His footsteps reached the kitchen before he did, the soft drag of bare feet on stone, the sound of a man still half assembled by sleep. Then he filled the doorway. He saw the jar first. The clay lid lay on the floor between them, one edge cracked against the stone flags, the dark binding cord loose beside it. His eyes moved from the lid to the open mouth of the jar to Pandora, pressed against the far wall with both hands already telling him everything. He did not cross to her. She did not move toward him. The table sat between them with the open jar on it, and the morning light came through the small window and fell across the terracotta as if nothing had changed, as if light did not know yet what it was illuminating. Neither of them spoke. Words would have required one of them to begin, and beginning meant naming it, and naming it meant it was real in a way that the next few seconds had not yet forced it to be. Pandora moved first. She crossed the table in 2 steps, seized the lid from the floor where it had lain since the opening, and brought it down hard against the jar's mouth, both palms flat. all her weight pressing through her arms into the clay. The rush stopped. The kitchen was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace, the way a wound is quiet after the blow, before the body has decided what to feel. Her breath came in ragged pulls. Beneath her palms, the terracotta was warm, not the warmth of morning stone or fired clay left in sunlight. Something else, a faint, rhythmic pressure pushed upward against her hands, patient and slow, like a pulse. She did not lift her palms. She pressed harder. Whatever remained inside was still moving. Far across the hills, a farmer named Doros stopped mid-furrow. His ox moved on without him, the plowshare cutting a slow curve into the dark loam, but Doros stood with the leather reins slack in his fists and felt something settle over his shoulders. Not cold, not pain, but a heaviness without name or cause, the way a room feels after someone has wept in it for a long time. He did not know why. He looked at the pale sky above the ridge and found no answer there. In a village lower down the valley, a girl named Thessa woke from a dream she could not describe. It followed her into the morning, clinging to the edges of her sight, so that when she helped her mother grind barley, she kept looking toward the open door. The scent of the grain was familiar, dry, powdery, faintly sweet, but it brought her no comfort. On the hillside above the river, an old shepherd pressed one hand to his calf, where a wound, long healed, began to ache in the bone. He had not thought about that wound in years. He thought about it now. Pandora stepped out of the doorway and onto the hillside, and the morning air met her, cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet limestone and bruised thyme where her foot had caught the edge of a low shrub. Below her the valley spread wide and pale in the haze. She stood still. She could see it, not with effort, simply with the eyes she had been given, eyes shaped by gods who saw across distances that would blind a mortal. Above the rooftops of the valley's nearest settlement, threads of something dark coiled through the brightening air. Not smoke, thinner than smoke and slower, moving the way ink moves when it first touches water, purposeful, almost patient, finding the spaces between things. She watched one thread settle over a cluster of houses like a low cloud that would never lift. Another drifted toward the river crossing, where a man was already pausing on the bridge, one hand pressed to his chest for no reason he could name. She had done that. Her hands, her decision, her morning. The thyme smell reached her again, sharp and green. She did not go back inside. His footsteps came through the dry grass a few moments later, the particular sound of a large man trying to move quietly. Epimetheus stopped beside her, close enough that she felt the warmth of his arm in the cool air. He did not look at her. He looked where she was looking. Then he said it. His brother had warned him. Those exact words, delivered at the threshold of Olympus, Prometheus gripping his wrist, saying, "Do not accept any gift from Zeus." And Epimetheus had stood there in the path's morning dust with Pandora beside him, her dark hair moving in the mountain wind, and he had thought, "I know what you are warning me about." He had chosen anyway. He would choose her again. The words landed without anger. That was what made them so difficult to hold. There was no accusation in them, only the clean, stripped-back weight of what had happened, offered to her plainly, the way a man sets down something heavy, not because he no longer wants it, but because his arms are tired. She felt it reach her chest and settle. Both things were true at once. He had loved her past all warnings, and the warnings had been right. Epimetheus went inside. She heard the door, the dull wooden knock of it against the frame, and then the hillside was hers alone. The guilt did not arrive like grief. It did not strike. It found her the way cold water finds the lowest place, moving slow, moving quiet, filling each hollow before it moved to the next. She felt it first behind her sternum, a pressure no wider than a thumb, then lower, then in the thin spaces between her ribs where breath lives. She had been made from river clay and mountain air, from Athena's weaving and Aphrodite's ache, from Hermes' coiling words. She understood now that each gift had been aimed, not given, aimed. The curiosity that would not sleep, the beauty that made her worth delivering, the tongue that could ask the right question and mean it. Zeus had not made a woman. He had made an opening. The valley below shimmered in the noon heat, and somewhere down in it the evils she had loosed were moving through the barley fields and the doorways of strangers. She had not been deceived. That was the weight she had not yet named until now. She had been constructed, precisely, patiently, to do exactly what she had done. She went back inside. The jar sat where she had left it, on the table in the afternoon light. The clay lid was still in place, the cord retied, not neatly, the knot too tight in one place and slack in another. The work of someone whose hands had not been steady. A single shaft of pale gold light came through the small window and fell across the table just short of the jar's belly, as though it would not quite touch. Pandora sat down. She pressed her palms flat against the table for a moment, feeling the cold grit of the stone beneath them. Then she leaned forward and put her ear against the clay. It was warm. The terracotta held the afternoon heat the way stone walls hold the memory of a day after the sun has gone. She closed her eyes. Something moved inside. Not a voice, not a pressure, a small, unhurried stirring, the way a seed shifts in dark soil without knowing yet that it will grow. It did not push toward her. It did not call. It simply waited. That waiting was not passivity. Pandora understood this now. Holding still, her ear still warm from the clay. Everything else that had been in the jar had moved toward the opening, not all at once, but with direction, with appetite, pressing into whatever gap the lid allowed. She had felt them go. Each one had wanted out. This did not want. She sat back and looked at the jar properly for the first time since she had resealed it. The meander band around the shoulder. The slight asymmetry where the cord pulled too tight on the left side. Nothing had changed in its appearance, and yet the jar felt different, lighter, she thought, and then corrected herself. Not lighter, less crowded. Whatever remained had not fled the open air when it had the chance. It had stayed close to the base, unhurried, while the others tore past it. That was not weakness. She pressed 2 fingers to the clay belly, gently. The terracotta was still warm. Beneath her fingertips, the faint stirring continued, patient, present, asking nothing at all. His shadow crossed the doorway before his footsteps did, the long amber shadow of a broad-shouldered man stopping at the threshold, reading the room before entering it. Epimetheus looked at her hands still resting on the jar. He looked at her face. Then he crossed to the shelf and lifted down the coil of spare cord and the small clay pot of pitch they kept beside the lamp oil. "Seal it," he said. His voice was low and careful and full of something that was not anger. Fresh pitch on the lid, cord twice around, back on the shelf. We don't touch it again. Pandora did not move her hands. "We've already lost enough," he said. The pitch pot made a soft knock against the table when he set it down. A small sound, but she felt it in her sternum. She heard the love in what he said. She heard it completely. But his palms were flat on the table, not touching the clay, and beneath her own fingers the faint warmth still moved, and he could not feel that. He was not wrong. He simply could not feel what she felt. Epimetheus left her the pitch pot and the cord and went to bed. The oil lamp burned low on the shelf beside the door, and its light caught the jar's reddish flank, the black meander band, the rope still wound at the neck. Pandora, sat with her hands folded in her lap now, not touching it. The warmth she had felt beneath her fingers all these hours was still there. She knew, without touching, that it was still there. The voice had been speaking since dusk. By midnight, it had grown thin. She sat with one choice in each hand: seal it. Pitch and cord, the small knock of the clay lid, Epimetheus's palms flat on the table. Release it, the binding cut, the last thing freed into a world already carrying so much. She held them both without moving. The lamp flame bent once in a draught and straightened. By the third hour, the voice was barely a breath, less sound than the memory of sound, the way a struck bronze bowl still hums after the hand has covered it. She could barely hear it. That barely was the thing. She rose, not because she had decided anything. Her legs simply carried her to the door, and her hand found the latch, and the night came in, cold, smelling of turned soil and the particular dry dust scent of limestone, cooling after a warm day, with something underneath it that was new and had no good name. She looked down into the valley. The village fires were there. 6 of them, maybe 7. The orange pinpoints she had watched every evening since she and Epimetheus had come to live on this hillside. But they burned low, lower than wind would take them. Wind guttered a fire sideways, made it lean and recover. These simply burned smaller, as though the hands feeding them had grown unsure between one branch and the next, had paused too long, had let the coals settle before remembering why they were tending the fire at all. She watched one dim further, then another. The cold air moved across her bare forearms, raising the small hairs along the skin. She turned back to the jar. The jar stood where she had left it, lid resting loose across the neck, the binding cord coiled beside it on the table. She crossed the kitchen, lifted the lid, set it down. Then she reached in. Her bare hand went into the dark of it, past the reddish curve of the inner wall, past the cool air that pooled at the bottom, and there was something there. Not smoke, not cold. Her fingers closed around a warmth about the size of a fig, dense and faintly pulsing, and the feeling that moved up through her palm and into her wrist was not heat exactly, but the memory of heat, a coal carried inside a folded cloth across a long distance. Still going. It did not pull away from her touch. It had been in there through all of it, through the voices, the opening, the scattering, the long night. And it had simply waited. The way a person waits who has learned that waiting is not the same as giving up. She brought her hands together around it, cradling it the way she might cradle a coal, carefully, without closing too tight. It did not speak in words. It did not need to. What moved from it into her was not a promise, nothing so large as that. It was smaller, the way a room is warmer than the air outside it, and the body understands this before the mind does. Stepping over the threshold and simply knowing, here is a place where the cold is not. What she felt was the knowledge that the gray light beginning at the window was real, that it would reach the floor, that the stone beneath her feet would hold, that the wound that lived behind her sternum had been this precise shape before, on different mornings, for different reasons, and had changed, not gone, changed. Her breath came slower. The thing in her palms went on glowing, soft and diffuse, with no particular urgency. It did not say the world would mend. It said only that the world was still going, that somewhere a fire had held through the night and would be fed again at first light, that the distance between now and bearable was measurable, that what felt finished sometimes carried, underneath it, one thread still uncut. She sat with that for a long time. The gray at the window deepened toward pale gold. Then it settled into place, not a thought, something prior to thought, a loosening in the muscles between her shoulder blades, as though a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten its name had simply transferred itself to the table, to the stone, to the ground beneath the house. She understood. The jar had not been a cage. The cord, the clay lid, the sealed neck, none of it had been punishment for hope, any more than a seed held in a closed fist is being punished. A world that had never ached would have held hope the way dry ground holds rain, let it run off, lost it to the slope. The evils had to come first. The wound had to be specific, had to be felt in the body, had to leave its precise shape. Only then would hope fit inside it. Only then would it have somewhere to go. The pale gold at the window was spreading now, reaching the edge of the table. She turned the small glowing thing in her palms, and her hands were steady. A footstep in the doorway. Epimetheus stood with one hand on the stone frame, bare-chested, his hair pressed flat on one side from sleep. His eyes moved to her hands first, to the small pale gold thing cupped in her palms, and then to her face. He did not come closer. He simply looked. She watched him take it in, the open jar, the faint light, the fact that she was standing still rather than hunched or shaking. His brow drew together, and then, slowly, released. Not relief, something more careful than relief. The look of a man setting down a stone he has carried long enough that his arms have forgotten what it felt like to be empty. Neither of them spoke. The gray at the window had warmed to gold now, a thin bar of it crossing the stone floor between them. Somewhere outside, a dove called once and stopped. In the silence that followed, the small light in her hands pulsed, barely, like a breath held and then let go. Epimetheus crossed the room. He stopped beside her and looked down at the thing she held, and she heard his breathing change, slower, steadier, the way a man's breathing changes when something that was braced in him quietly lets go. He did not ask what it was. He did not need to. She carried hope to the doorway. The morning air came in cold off the valley, carrying the smell of wet limestone and bruised thyme, and Pandora stepped into the full breadth of it, the threshold stone smooth and slightly gritty under her bare feet, the sky above the far ridge already pale gold where the sun pressed up behind it. She opened her hands. It did not rise. It did not flee. It thinned, the way a thread of wood smoke thins when the draught takes it, dispersing not into nothing, but into everything, spreading outward in all directions at once, until the boundaries of it were simply the boundaries of the air itself. Within moments, she could not have said where it ended. It was in the wind, already moving down toward the valley. It was in the cold that touched her wrists where her sleeves had fallen back. It was in the space between one breath and the next. Her palms were empty. She stood there in the open doorway, the morning coming in around her, and did not close her hands. Down in the valley, a woman named Leia knelt before her hearthstone in the gray before sunrise, and pressed a handful of dried oak shavings into the embers. The flame caught, small and amber and immediate, and she sat back on her heels with her hands on her thighs and felt something she could not name settle into her chest like a stone placed gently, not dropped. The day ahead had weight, but the weight was the weight of something she could carry. She did not know why she knew this. She simply did. Not far from there, a girl of perhaps 7 summers woke from a dream she had already begun to forget. Something dark, something pressing, something that had asked too much of her small sleeping mind. She lay still a moment. The heaviness was lifting, the way river fog lifts when the first real warmth finds it. Then her feet found the floor, and her legs found the door, and she ran through the low morning light, through the smell of wood smoke and cold mud and new grass. And the running itself was the answer to a question no one had thought to ask. And so it was that Pandora set the jar back on the table. She did not place it carefully. She simply put it down, the flat base meeting the stone with a soft, hollow knock. And then she sat, and her hands came to rest on either side of it, not touching it, just near. Epimetheus pulled the other stool close and sat beside her. His shoulder met hers. Neither of them spoke. The jar was just clay, reddish-brown, round-bellied, old. The crack along the lid's edge caught the morning light coming through the small window. A thin line of shadow, nothing more. The binding cord lay loose on the table beside it, its fibers slightly frayed where her fingers had worked the knot apart in the dark. It smelled of the shelf it had sat on. Dust and dried thyme hung nearby, and the faint mineral coldness of old terracotta. Outside, a pair of swallows crossed the window's square of sky, so fast they were gone before the eye could follow. The morning went on. A pot needed filling. Somewhere on the hillside, a goat's bell rang once and then was quiet. Warmth was already gathering in the stone of the windowsill, and the light on the floor stretched its long, pale rectangle toward the far wall and held it there. Pandora looked at the jar for a long time. Then she stopped looking at it and simply sat with it, the way you sit with something that no longer needs you to decide anything. Epimetheus did not move. His breathing was slow, his forearm warm against hers. She had been made. She had chosen. The world was different for both. And still the morning came in through the window, unhurried, the way mornings always had, the way they always would. And Pandora sat inside it, neither made nor unmade, only here, only now. Her hands open on the table beside an empty jar that had once held everything.